Good morning. Thank you for coming. The first session, the morning sessions are always somewhat lightly attended. I think students are afternoon people. I have two young children, not young children, but young adult children, who I don't think have ever seen 9 o'clock in their lives, except from the other end. So welcome to the Baker Peace Conference, and in the great tradition of the Baker Peace Conference, of course, we had computer problems at the outset, but they're sorted out now and we're ready to go. I will keep the introduction extremely short. I just want to introduce my colleague who is going to chair the panel, Professor John Brobst, who is our professor of British history and imperial history, who will be introducing the members of the panel.
And apparently, good morning. Welcome to the first panel on the outbreak of World War I. It's a real pleasure to have this group of three distinguished scholars of the era, well, more than the era prior to World War I, but certainly focusing on that era from the standpoint of strategy and diplomacy. I'm going to introduce each of the three now, and then they'll speak in the order I've introduced them, and then after that, we can open the floor to questions. Our first speaker is Professor Keith Neilson, who is now Professor Emeritus in the History Department at the Royal Military College of Canada in Kingston, Ontario, so a virtual neighbor of us here in Ohio. His field of expertise is in British foreign and defense policy from the late 19th through the mid-20th centuries, with a particular interest in Anglo-Russian and Anglo-Soviet relations. He's the author of a number of books, Britain, Soviet Russia, and the Collapse of the Versailles Order, 1919 to 1939, published in 2005, and more recently authored with Thomas Ott, and a subject dear, as students who've had me will know, a subject that can only be dear to those who work on English bureaucrats, who actually are important. The Permanent Undersecretary of Foreign Affairs, 1854 to 1946. That particular office. He doesn't list on here, but I have to say from my own standpoint, Professor Neilson's most influential book, at least on me, was Britain and Last Tsar, on Britain's relations with Nicholas II, which is probably, at least in my judgment, the definitive study of that subject. At present, Professor Neilson is writing a book on British foreign policy during the first years of World War II, 1939 to 1941, which has sometimes been described, or at least a chunk of that, as the phony war, the argument being it wasn't so phony at all. And in fact, there's quite a bit of complication, not least the issue of keeping neutrals neutral, and so on. Our second speaker is Nick Lambert, who is an affiliate professor at the University of Maryland. Professor Lambert is the author of 3 books and the editor of a volume of historical documents on the origins of the British submarine service. His first monograph, Sir John Fisher's Naval Revolution, was awarded the 2000 in the year 2000, the Society for Military History's Distinguished Book Prize, and it also won the Western Front Association's Norman Tomlinson Prize, which he won again for his most recent book, Planning Armageddon, British Economic Warfare and the First World War, which I had the pleasure of being on a large roundtable, published roundtable review of, and it got a unanimously very strong endorsement from the 4 of us who were reviewers of that book. Nick has also published in the Journal of Modern History, the Journal of Strategic Studies, War and History, the Journal of Military History, and several of these articles have themselves won prizes, including the Institute for Historical Researches at the University of London, Julian Corbett Prize, and 3 times he has won the Society for Military History's Mankado Prize. After completing his undergraduate and graduate degrees at Oxford, Lambert has held fellowships from Yale, Wolfson College, Oxford, Southampton University in England, my own alma mater, Texas at Austin, and the Australian National University in Canberra. He has taught courses at various institutions, most recently at Penn and at the University of Maryland, College Park. Our third speaker is Dr. Sean McMeekin, who is professor of modern history at Koç University in Istanbul, Turkey. He is the author of several books, The Red Millionaire in 2004, History's Greatest Heist in 2008, and his third book was The Berlin-Baghdad Express on the Berlin-Baghdad Railroad, built in the early 20th century. It actually won, that book on the Berlin-Baghdad Railroad, won the Barbara Yelovich Prize, which will be dear to Steve Miner. Barbara Yelovich was his supervisor. And Dr. McMeekin is also a winner of the Tomlinson Prize, but only one. For his recent book, The Russian Origins of the First World War, which I suspect may tell us that geopolitical dangers are perhaps as dangerous as ideological ones. That book has also been listed for the Lionel Gelber and Marshall Schulman Prizes. His fifth book, July 1914, Countdown to War, was published in 2013 by Basic Books and in the US and Canada, and by Icon Books in the United Kingdom. Chinese and German translations are underway or forthcoming. The German's out. His next book, the current book he's working on, is entitled The War of Ottoman Succession, which will be published by Penguin next year. So I think with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Neilson first.
Good morning to you all. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me. It's a great honor to come. Stephen Miner has been kind enough to bring me here, and Connie Hunter has ensured that I arrived safe and sound, and I can only give her the highest accolades for her organizational skills. Very helpful. Now today, perhaps I should take off my coat. I'm hot enough already. I'd like to talk to you about a number of things, but the principal point in one way that I want to make is that history is not a cut and dried subject. It hasn't, just because it's occurred, doesn't mean that that discussion of it has ended. And for those of us who've often had people come up to and say, why do you study history anyway? It's over and you can't do anything about it. This is to explain a little bit about why it is important to continue to look at these kinds of major events to show that there's a lively academic debate about them, and that even 100 years later, people are not sure of what happened or agreed as to why it happened. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about the origins of the First World War. I'm going to begin by talking about the standard explanations that many people have taken in school, how these came about, and then I'm going to explain why, in my opinion, most of them are entirely wrong. And I will do this by looking at the British case in some detail. Now, the standard accounts of the First World War were constructed by commentators in the 1920s and 1930s. And at that point, the only evidence that they had to consider were contemporary remarks and the documents that were made available by governments that had participated in the war itself. Now, as one might expect, these documents were chosen carefully by the governments, especially the losing governments, to explain and to justify the decisions they had taken in 1914. As a result of this, lacking good solid evidence, commentators, historians amongst them, explained the origins of the war in terms of structures and circumstances. It was, they contended, the result of rampant militarism, of arms races, of interlocking alliance structures, underpinned by secret diplomacy and the grievances of submerged nationalities. Hands up for all of you who've been told that in various courses. And it's a standard way of approaching a complicated subject. Now, these explanations, at least in the popular mind, have held the field ever since. No doubt many of, as I said, of you were taught such things. But there are many problems with such explanatory models. First, they do not explain why the assassination at Sarajevo in 1914 and the responses to it did not merely result in a third Balkan War along the lines of the two that had preceded it in 1912 and 1913. The explanatory models also create an air of inevitability. What happened had to happen. The possibility of alternative courses is closed off. The issue of decision-making, the fact that various individuals had to take various actions and make various decisions for war to occur, is omitted. Instead, the decisions for war emerge from the models themselves rather than from any analysis of the actions of specific people. So in short, it's a black box. Things go in and an obvious answer comes out, and we're still wondering why exactly this occurred. Now, before the July crisis of 1914 can be considered, some background needs to be laid. In particular, the explanatory frameworks posit that Europe was divided into fixed opposing power blocs in 1914, the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy, and the Triple Entente of Britain, France, and Russia. In this model, once war began, the two opposing alliances assured that the great powers, as they were called, would be committed to the war. That is some of the international background, but the domestic background for my particular case that we're going to look at today for Britain is vital. In 1914, Britain was governed by the Liberal Party, which had been in power since 1905. A fundamental belief of the Liberal Party was that the world was interconnected, particularly economically, something based on the theories of Adam Smith, which had taken on a greater reality in the second half of the 19th century. And because the world was interconnected, this made war both morally unjustifiable and largely impossible. Combined with this was the assumption that reasonable men could come to reasonable agreement by discussion and debate. And such thinking infused the party to a greater or lesser extent. The extreme believers in such an approach were the so-called radicals, whose relatively small numbers had a disproportionate voice in a government whose majority in the second election of 1910 was extremely small. If the radicals were to vote against their own party, then the government would fall. However, within the Liberal Party itself, there was a group of more hard-nosed people, the so-called liberal imperialists, who realized that Britain lived in a wicked world and that the force and the threat of force could not be written off in the international sphere. These men occupied very important positions in the government. The Prime Minister, Asquith, the Foreign Secretary, Edward Grey, were dominant figures within the government, but they realized, of course, that they had to work within the constraints created by many of their colleagues not accepting their approach to international politics. Now, in international affairs, as you might expect, the Liberal government pursued a policy of trying to be on good terms with all of the great powers. This was largely a continuation in practice of the policies pursued by the preceding conservative, or unionist, as it was called, government. In 1902, the previous government had signed a formal military alliance with Japan, designed to check the spread of Russian power in the Far East. However, that alliance was what you might call a best of the worst possible choices, since an agreement with Russia itself would have been a preferable one, but one that St. Petersburg, the Russian government, was unable to accept. 2 years later, in 1904, the conservatives had signed the Auntaunt Cordial, designed to lessen the colonial points of conflict between the two countries. But it's very important to remember that there was no military component to this Entente. Neither country was obliged to provide support, either militarily or navally, to the other. Thus, when the Liberals come to power in 1906, Britain seemed on reasonable terms with one long-standing enemy, France, and had protected her interests in the Far East against another, Russia, with an alliance hedged in terms that made it unlikely ever to be implemented, as the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905 demonstrated. It is true that the Liberals came to power just in the time for a British-German quarrel over Morocco, and the French immediately asked for military talks about this. But the talks were not automatic, nor were they permanent. As Sir Edward Grey, the Foreign Secretary, told the British Embassy in the midst of the Moroccan crisis, and I quote, "Diplomatic support we are pledged to give to France, and we are giving it. A promise in advance committing this country to take part in a continental war is another matter, and a very serious one. It is very difficult for any British government to get an engagement of this kind. It changes the Entente into an alliance, and alliances, especially continental alliances, are not in accordance with our traditions." So in short, the British are saying nice things. I mean, I think we could see this right now with what people are saying to the Ukraine. We're very much in favor of you, but we're not going to help you in the slightest. So true to liberal ideas, the new government moved quickly to pursue a course of international harmony once the first Moroccan crisis had been ended without recourse to war. In 1907, the British supported international efforts at arms control at the Second Hague Conference, and in the same year, the Liberals found that Russia, suffering from the effects of the Russo-Japanese War, was willing now to discuss the major issues between the two countries. The result of this was the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907, which solved the colonial issues between the two countries with respect to Persia, Tibet, and Afghanistan, but of course had absolutely no military component whatsoever. It was simply a way of lessening tension between the two countries then. So by 1908, Britain had an entente with France and a convention with Russia, neither of which agreements committed London to any military action or any particular diplomatic position. Sir Edward Grey had seemingly achieved the millennium in Britain's foreign policy, being on relatively good terms with all of the great powers, with the exception of the Germans, who were pursuing a naval building program that threatened British naval hegemony. We'll talk more about that later. It's this alignment that has been termed and was occasionally termed at the time the Triple Entente, as France, of course, had a binding military alliance with Russia and had had one since 1894. But in contradistinction to the Triple Alliance, that of Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy, the Triple Entente was not in any way a binding agreement. Britain had no obligation to support either Russia or France, however much St. Petersburg and Paris wished this to be the case. The indefinite nature of the Triple Entente became even more evident in the years before 1914. While Britain supported France diplomatically on occasion, as in the Second Moroccan crisis, it had not been obliged to do so by treaty, and the decision to do so had been taken by a small faction of the Liberal Party in August 1911. Now, it is really quite important to remember that it takes place in August 1911, which is after Parliament has risen. So there are only a few MPs available, and the ones who were called to this meeting were the liberal imperialists, who all agreed that Britain might have to do something. The rest of the party, which would have obviously voted against this, were on holidays hunting and fishing in the usual fashion of the British government. Now, this hastily called decision, or hastily made decision, never had to be implemented. The second Moroccan crisis ended without any kind of conflict. But as soon as the factions who opposed Grey's policy in his own party found out about this, they attacked him savagely in the autumn of 1911, both in Parliament and within the party itself. And this was based on two things. First, he had committed, or appeared to have committed, Britain to something that none of them agreed with. And second, they didn't like the fact that Russia was behaving badly in Persia. Russia was viewed as anathema, or was anathema, to many of the people in the Liberal Party. Russia had secret police. They had no civil liberties. They sent people to Siberia and were thus an unacceptable ally or even associate of Britain's. So the result of this was that Grey was forced to submit all of his foreign policy decisions both to the full cabinet, which included many people who didn't agree with him, and to a parliamentary committee that was called the Foreign Policy Committee in order that they could make sure that he wasn't doing something behind their back. So Gray's political position in all of this is weakened in many ways. This is not like say, an autocratic government in Germany or in Russia. This is one where, without the backing of his own party, Gray cannot pursue a foreign policy as such. He has to have full agreement in all of this. So, also, of course, this CID meeting at the Committee of Imperial Defense was called to perhaps send British troops to the continent. In most standard accounts, this says now Britain is inevitably going to send troops to the continent in any war. This is simply not true. In October of 1911, 3 months after the decision in August, he discussed war planning with a prominent liberal in all of this. And in his diary, Lord Esher, the prominent liberal, wrote, "I asked the Prime Minister whether he thought that it would be possible to have an English force concentrated in France within 7 days of the outbreak of war, in view of the fact that the Cabinet had not heard of the plan. He thinks it impossible. How would this astound the General Staff?" So in short, the idea that this somehow inevitably committed Britain to the continent in any future activities was completely wrong. Gray, as I said, he also found himself attacked over his policy towards Russia in all of this. So the foreign secretary had to make concessions. He has to pass all of this stuff past the cabinet. He has to pass it through a foreign policy committee. And Gray, it is agreed, has to make no communication with Russia or France, however benign and non-binding, that might give rise to expectations of British support without the cabinet's full knowledge. Now, this new position is evident in 1912, when the Anglo-French naval talks were entered into as part of Gray's attempt to get on good terms with both Paris and Berlin. A naval mission is sent to Berlin at the same time. As Gray noted at the time, the Cabinet has now the same knowledge of what has taken place that the Prime Minister and I have. All subsequent talks with the great powers were similarly fully reported to Cabinet. Now, if this is Gray's circumstances, it is also clear that he has not committed at all irrevocably to the Triple Alliance. Russia made any kind of commitment of this sort particularly difficult. And by 1914, it is very evident that the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907, which is up for renewal at this point, is unlikely to be renewed. The quarrels over Persia and Russia's behavior generally make it such that the British don't think they're going to be able to come to terms with the Russians on any kind of acceptable terms to themselves. The issue of Persia's to the fore domestically in London, and Russia's recovery from the Russo-Japanese War, Russia's great program of rebuilding its army and its burgeoning economy, meant that Russia was unlikely to accommodate any kind of British objections to what it does in Persia. And at the same time, it's very important to remember that by 1912, Anglo-German relations are improving dramatically. In 1911, the Germans had decided that their naval policy of trying to outbuild the British fleet was too expensive. With the increase in the size of the French army and the increase in the size of the Russian army, the Germans have decided that the money is better spent increasing the size of the German army in order to meet the more immediate threat posed by the Franco-Russian alliance than it is at some sort of wider global politic of trying to threaten the British by building a bigger fleet. So as a result of all of this, in June of 1914, Sir Edward Grey has authorized preliminary clandestine talks between Sir William Tyrrell, who was one of the principal people in the Foreign Office in the civil service. Tyrrell has very strong German connections. He was raised in a German family because his father had died, so His mother was German. He'd been raised in a German family. He knew everyone in Germany. He was going to arrange to go on his holidays and have preliminary discussions with the Germans about how to reduce the tension between the two countries. Now, of course, this doesn't come to pass because the war breaks out. Like any good Englishman, he was going to take his holidays in August, and that didn't work out well. But it's very evident from this that the idea of fixed groupings, triple entente, triple alliance, is really a construct from later, after the war begins, and in explanation since. Britain was moving towards either a policy of the free hand or perhaps a policy much more pro-German than had been the case before. But in fact, what you look at this carefully is that Grey believes that he can be on good terms with everyone. He doesn't need to commit himself to one side or the other. This then is the background to the July crisis. When the Archduke was assassinated by the Serbian terrorists, this raised little concern in Britain. Political assassination had been a mainstay of Balkan politics in the past 30 years, and this was simply seen as another unfortunate episode in all of this. In the same way that when another truckload of bombers blows something up at Fallujah or something, no one notices it anymore. It's just that's how politics take place there. So there was little reason to think when the Archduke was assassinated that this might lead to anything more than another localized Balkan war that would not involve Britain at all. British political attention was, of course, focused instead on the Irish situation, where there was a possibility of civil war between the Ulsterites and the rest of the Irish. So it's not until the last week of July, really, that it becomes apparent in London that the July crisis has a possibility of leading to a European-wide war. When Edward Grey brought this to the cabinet on the 29th of July, it became evident how little room for maneuver he had politically. Grey outlined the circumstances and pointed out the various possibilities and perils for Britain. There was no cabinet consensus. A large faction was opposed to Britain's doing anything beyond striving for peace. Another faction saw more danger and pointed out that a German attack on France might be disadvantageous to Britain in the longer run. But any concrete response that might lead to war was, with respect to that, nothing was decided. One of the members of the radical movement, these people who are opposed to war generally, Jack Pease, put it nicely in his diary. It seems, he said, we could do nothing right and we shall be liable for anything that happened. The cabinet agreed that we must do the best for our own interests that was in the course of peace. A very vague kind of remark. The following day, on the 30th of July, the leading light in the radical faction in Parliament, Arthur Ponsonby, wrote to Asquith to outline clearly the radical position. Britain, he contended, had no obligation to take any action. London had no treaty obligation. British interests, he wrote, were not involved in the affair, and no British honor or even sentiments of friendship were involved. The radical group, he pointedly observed, would leave the government if Britain were to become involved in anything beyond attempting to avoid a war. And within the cabinet, it was clear that many shared these sentiments. As the Colonial Secretary Lewis Harcourt wrote on the 30th of July, it is now clear that this cabinet will not join the war. The idea of making common cause with Russia was unacceptable. If Russia proved to be unreasonable in negotiations to avoid war, Harcourt went on, Britain was sure not to take any joint action. Now, there were countervailing voices. Winston Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty, was all for war, particularly as the 1912 naval discussions with France had resulted in France moving its fleet to the Mediterranean, while the Royal Navy concentrated in the North Sea and the Channel. In these circumstances, Churchill was adamant that Germany could not be allowed to attack the French coast. Another cabinet minister, the Treasury Secretary, Edwin Montagu, was convinced that Britain would be pulled into the war in any circumstances and should enter on the side of France and Russia. Such an attitude was also prevalent in the Foreign Office amongst the civil servants there, as one might expect. Many of them felt that not to go into the war would be to abandon Britain's position as a great power and to no matter what would turn out in the war, would be to Britain's longer-term advantage. But, and as you might expect, British or French and Russian diplomats were absolutely adamant that Britain had to join the war. Of course they were, because naturally enough, they had based much of their own plans on the hope that Britain would enter the war. But the fact that they were concerned about it underlines the fact that Britain had no obligation to go to war. They were merely trying to create an obligation. The French French ambassador to Britain once said on the 31st of July, when Grey told him he couldn't promise that Britain would help, Cambon says, "The word honor can have no meaning in English if London fails to support France." Well, yes, what would you expect him to say in all of this? So what we get then is on a Sunday, on the 2nd of August, the cabinet meeting on a Sunday, it's just a disaster. They have two meetings, one in the morning, one in the afternoon in all of this. Now, 6 cabinet ministers had agreed before this meeting that they would resign if war were to be the policy. Now, 6 cabinet ministers is a lot of people in all of this. But one of them wrote to his wife about this, and he said that he was going to resign. And she says, "What do you mean by sticking to the ship? Do you intend resigning?" And then she says, "You couldn't do that in a moment of difficulty such as we have now," and then pointedly added, "and you have no business prospects to look forward to." A key point in all of this. So the cabinet met twice that day. At the first session, Grey outlined the circumstances and his actions. Knowing his audience, he appealed to their sense of international law and rectitude. He emphasized that Britain had a treaty obligation to Belgium, made it clear that he would resign if Britain failed to protect the French coast against German raids, and pointed out that the consequences of the war would affect Britain regardless of its actions in all this. It's important to remember here that the stock exchange is closed for the first time in 100 years, just before the weekend begins. For liberals whose belief in the pacific effect of international trade, this was a key point, and Nick Lambert will expand upon this later on. It's also important that many of the cabinet ministers drew their living from their investments, which would be threatened or unavailable if the exchanges remained closed. So, looming in the background is another fact. The opposition Conservative Party had made its position clear. It would support, and in fact was in favor of, British entry into the war. Clandestine explorations of a possible coalition government in which Winston Churchill was prominent were underway. Thus, many of the ministers were reluctant to enter the war, but saw themselves faced with a dilemma. They could stay true to their own principles and resign, but this would fail to keep Britain out of the war, and they would be replaced by their conservative opponents in a new coalition government. So nothing would be achieved in a practical sense then. So this combination of consequences changed minds. At the Sunday morning session, a large number of ministers had opposed war. By the afternoon, this number had been whittled down through private discussions and soul-searching to an acceptable few. Faced with the harsh choices mentioned above, all but 4 decided to hang together rather than hang separately. The following day, Edward Grey put all of this discussion together in a speech to the House of Commons. Again, he knew his audience. He spoke in sorrow rather than anger. He explained how he had tried to convince the contending parties to negotiate rather than to fight. He pointed out that Britain, while possessing a free hand, was obliged by its respect for international law and pacific behavior not to stand aloof and see international norms flouted. He also emphasized that even if Britain remained neutral, she would be affected by the whirlwind of war. So this combination of high principle and low self-interest proved irresistible. He gained full support for his party of telling Germany that if Berlin did not immediately cease its offensive actions and refrain from invading Belgium, Britain would join the fray, and as a result of this, he got near unanimous support. The following day, Germany rejected the British ultimatum, and Britain was at war. Now, the fact fact that this was so did not reflect, as we have seen, any automatic British response to the events of July. And this uncertainty, how am I doing for time? 5 minutes? Good. The uncertainty is underlined further if we look at what the British did once war was enjoined. The idea that the British should immediately send a force to the continent, the British Expeditionary Force, or BEF, was not set in stone. Since that time, the Admiralty advanced a new policy that seemed more attractive to the Liberal government. The Royal Navy had made elaborate plans for economic warfare, which Nick Lambert will talk about later on, which they thought would make either war impossible or make it very brief, as the world economy would collapse if international transport were interdicted. And this, in any case, would not involve large armies or casualties. This plan was immediately put into place, but by September, it was transmogrified into a similar but distinct plan for blockade, since repercussions of strict economic warfare offended both neutrals and the British merchant interests. A collapsed international economy would destroy British commerce as well as that of Germany, which doesn't, in a trading nation, isn't an acceptable position. And the new Secretary of State for War, Lord Kitchener, was not convinced by the arguments of the Continentalists within the British Army, who contended that the British Expeditionary Force would be a vital part of the French defense against a German attack. Kitchener instead was more concerned about the possibility of home defense, that is to say, of a German invasion, and the Irish situation. He, instead of sending 6 divisions to the continent, he preferred to send 4, and he wanted to, by doing this, of course, he completely disrupts the plans that have been worked out for sending them to France. He also wants to send them to a different port than had been agreed with, which of course would have messed up the French railway timetables and the like. Much debate ensues, so it takes 6 days after the British declare war before they actually send troops to the continent, which is far later than had ever been envisioned. So, with the guns of August firing, let us return to the issues that I raised at the beginning of the lecture. It's very clear, it seems to me, that the decisions of 1914 were not preordained at all, that they were, in the British case at least, highly contingent on events, on politics and the like, and the decisions taken by individual members of the cabinet. It is entirely possible that Britain could have remained out of the war with whatever that result that would have had, and that the explanations that are created or that we are always teaching our students are ones that are made after the war, to try and impose some kind of rigor upon what otherwise would be one damn thing after another, as you might say. If you can explain it with models and things of this nature, then of course the political scientists like this enormously, because they can then make nonsensical predictions about how people will behave in the future without realizing that decisions are always taken by people. People are much harder to predict than models are to construct in all of this. So it seems to me that the important part about this, and one of the things that underlines why it's good to study history, is that there are no lessons of history at all. Every new historical event is a new historical event. But what you can do by studying history is to appreciate that fact, to realize that similar things have happened in the past, and that there will be similar problems that will have to be considered at this time. Now, politicians don't like this much because, of course, when they go to experts, they want answers. They don't want people to say, you know, you have to look at this very carefully, do some studying, and do the best you can. What they want is someone to say, if you'll do A, B, and C, then, of course, D will automatically fall, and that's what you want. I was once told by a man who had been Lyndon Johnson's military aide-de-camp that when they were discussing issues about Vietnam, they would go to a Harvard professor who would give them a 30-page nuanced account, complete with footnotes and the like, whereas the Marine colonel would propose the one-page, 6-point plan that would resolve it all. And the issue was which one of these was going to be read and acted upon. I'm afraid, it seems to me that this is the interesting part of history, is that it reveals to us the complexity of events, the contingency of events, and the fact that nothing is ever inevitable. It all depends on what people decide. So, thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Dr. Nick Lambert.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I should like to begin by thanking Steve Miner and John Brobst for inviting me here to Athens to talk at the Baker Peace Conference. And I should also like to thank Connie Hunter for getting me here and everybody else. I have not the slightest doubt that had Connie Hunter been in charge of logistics in 1914, that the war would indeed have been over by Christmas. Or before the leaves fell. And it probably wouldn't make any difference which side you were on. Which brings me actually to the topic that I propose to talk about today, the short war illusion. Now I know that it has become fashionable in recent years to downplay the importance or the prevalence of this short war illusion. But I do strongly believe that, like all revisionism, it can be carried a little bit too far. Discovering that some additional particular general or admiral, in fact, didn't believe anything of the kind, that the war would all be over so quickly, is of limited significance, I think. For every General Haig, there is a General Henry Wilson who believes quite the opposite. The point is that the majority of officers or military leaders did appear to genuinely believe in the prospect of a war measured in months rather than years. But of course, we can't only look, and this is the important thing, I think, to remember, is that you can't just look at the military. You have to look at the civilian decision makers in the government themselves, newspaper editors, leading figures in society. For every Kitchener who believes in the prospect of a long war, and I'm not entirely convinced that he certainly isn't consistent on the point, there is a H.H. Asquith who believes quite the opposite. The whole idea, but the real point to get across is that the whole idea of a short war illusion is tied up, very, very closely tied up with liberal ideology. Liberal ideology and creed stretching way back into the 18th and 19th centuries. And this is often forgotten or overlooked by too many students of naval and military history. The idea that international disputes can be settled without violence by reasoned discussion and arguments between men of goodwill is the basis of most liberal Western thinking. The second element in this is the belief in the virtues of a free trade and free trading system. The idea that by strengthening and multiplying personal connections between different peoples, men will become to appreciate their fundamental, their community of interests. And you can just see right the way through, from Thomas Paine through Richard Cobden, John Bright, down to John Stuart Mill, that there is this belief that the promotion of trade will nurture peace. Quite interestingly, though, all of these men are talking about the possibilities of trade nurturing peace in the future tense. The situation, of course, changes dramatically by the end of the 19th century. I mean, by the end of the 19th century, the world has changed really quite dramatically, and nothing more so than, in fact, the very world economic system. Now, I happen to believe that the world is fundamentally an economic entity. rather than a political one or any other variation you choose. And I think the importance of understanding the dynamics of the world economic system is actually fundamental to understanding so much of what is going on in 1914. I should sort of promise right now I'm not going to talk too much economics. I'm aware that whenever anybody stands up and talks economics, half the people bolt for the door. As my last book had the word economics in the title, and the press editor said to me, "Are you absolutely certain you had to have the title economics in the title?" And I said, "Well, yes, it's about economic warfare. I can't really think of a way of getting around this." And they said, "Well, that's a pity, because that slashed potential sales in half." Throw in a few Fishers and Churchills, and and maybe you get numbers up. In any case, so I will try not to talk about too much economics. But really, the point is that between 1870 and 1913, the volume of world trade doubles and redoubles. And what does this really all mean? At the turn of basically what it means is by the turn of the 20th century, there is widespread recognition among political and economic analysts that the world was experiencing or had experienced epochal change. The forces unleashed by the agricultural and industrial revolutions were joined after 1870 by sharp drops in the cost of transportation by land and by sea, major innovations in financial services, the commoditization of certain key commodities, wheat, grain, cotton, and of course, above all, by the creation of a communications network that permitted instantaneous communications between practically any 2 points on the globe. I could talk at length of the significance of the development of cable communications, and how the way that business is conducted on a day-to-day level is fundamentally transformed by the invention of the cable. And it is astonishing how quickly the way that business is transacted is changed to accommodate, or it becomes built around the availability of the cable. In any case, during the same period, all nations, especially in industrialized European powers, do see a steady rise in the ratio of foreign trade to national economic output, and that transnational linkages and interdependencies have multiplied and intensified to the point where you can legitimately talk about a global trading system functioning on a worldwide basis. Commercial supply chains are really already beginning to stretch around the world. Just-in-time ordering is beginning to occur in not just in the acquisition of foodstuffs, but in industrial processes. And the point being is, national economies are becoming increasingly intertwined. Now, the idea of economic independence really does have enormous strategic implications. Really, as a result of these changes in the structure of the world economy, the economic well-being of whole societies has come to depend upon a highly optimized economic system. It's self-dependent upon the free flow of international trade, and of course, no less importantly, upon the access to real-time communications. And it is particularly with industrialized nation states with large urban populations, social and political stability really does increasingly require high levels of economic prosperity, made possible by this steady flow of goods and staples through the trading system. And even at the most basic level, urban populations require a steady supply of food for their daily bread, yes, as they have effectively no reserves of their own. Cities contain stockpiles measured in, well, what was on the shelves, possibly in days, possibly to last a few weeks. No less importantly, industrial producers are dependent upon selling their produce in a constant stream, a flow of commerce. If it piles up on wharves in a dock, yes, they're in serious trouble, as with the banking system that extended the loans to them. Recognizing these changes is really, it is probably one of the most interesting and important developments in this pre-war period. Now, these ideas of the strategic implications of economic interdependence were first discussed, really, they're beginning to start occurring in the 1890s. There are a number of contemporary commentators who talk about this. Most prominently is Ivan Bloch, a fascinating Polish financier who, with enormous practical experience in the War of 1870 between Russia and Turkey. I know he's often thought on or talked about and discussed in the context of his ideas on the importance of modern weaponry and firepower, but that wasn't his central message at all. His central message is, in fact, it's this idea that you can't prolonged economic war or prolonged warfare risks economic dislocation, disruption, with major social consequences. Another man to talk about this in this time, the 1890s, this might be a bit of a surprise, is Alfred Thayer Mahan. I wonder how many people who've actually very few people have actually read Alfred Thayer Mahan. Fascinating man, much maligned and much misunderstood. But he's actually talking in these terms too, particularly in his private correspondence with Teddy Roosevelt. But also in his various articles, not just his books. But if you look closely in his books, you'll see it there too. In addition, you have the various theoreticians, economic theoreticians. You have Robert Giffin. I don't know if anybody here is familiar with the name Robert Giffin. Anyone do Economics 101 and downward sloping demand curves? No? Okay. Lies, damned lies, and statistics. That was him. It wasn't, who's it often credited to? Thomas Jefferson, probably. Everything gets credited to him. It wasn't him, it was Robert Giffin. Marshall at Cambridge, John Maynard Keynes is even in here. And this whole idea, all these ideas are, of course, most famously popularized by Norman Angell, the British journalist, commentator who goes on to win the Nobel Peace Prize, and whose book, The Great Illusion, sells, 2 million copies before 1914. Recognizing these changes, how do I put this? Never mind. I mean, really, there's a tremendous difference between the ideas of these men and the liberal economic theorists of the mid-19th century, in a sense that there is, never mind this harmony and common interest stuff. What Bloch and Mahan and a number of others are saying is that the modern industrial economies are not in the future, but now dependent upon access to the global trading system. Yes. And they are talking about at length, they're making this point again, social stability in major Western societies is dependent upon high levels of economic prosperities. So the point really is this short war illusion is really a short war, to borrow Dennis Showalter's phrase, a short war necessity. That this whole illusion is founded upon economics and beliefs in the essential fragility of modern society, and recognition also that there are major fault lines, dangerous fault lines between state and society that will be placed under considerable strain in the event of a war, and particularly in the event of a prolonged war. Now, in terms of planning and what's the actual impact on preparations for war? Well, in the early part of the 20th century, military planners and political decision makers do actively contemplate the implications of all this. I'm not going to talk about the impact on Germany, the ideas of von Schlieffen and von Moltke. There are too many people in this room far better qualified than me to discuss the importance of these ideas of Bloch underpinning the operational planning and the choices made in Germany for the operational planning made. Really what I'm more interested in is in looking at Britain, UK. Now you might think that standing at the center of the epicenter of the world economic system, that Britain has more to lose than most. That was how it appears to be. But the fascinating thing is that in Britain, they actually took one look at this and they came to the conclusion that there was a great deal of profit to be had in the confusion that would attend the beginning of a war. And this is, you might think, somewhat unlikely. And unlike in apparently, in Germany, Britain, and many other countries, in Britain, they're actively looking very, very closely at the economics underpinning short war thinking and short war assumptions. And as I say, they believe that they can turn this potential Armageddon in the economic system to their advantage. And they develop what I have termed the concept of economic war as distinct from blockade. This is very different, I should hasten to say, between the traditional ideas of applying force or blockade. It isn't just, you're not just under blockade, you're employing sea power to basically interdict and blockade and stop up trade by closing enemy ports. Economic warfare is much more comprehensive. It's not just the employment of sea power, but it's basically manipulating economic systems at the same time to coordinate this. And the ones they're particularly interested in looking at controlling is where Britain has effective monopoly control, which are global shipping and financial services industries, global communications systems, and the fourth one would be energy, coal, exportable coal. In all cases, Britain, in terms of shipping, financial services, and communications, Britain has somewhere between 60, 70, 80% control over the available resources. And they have an ability to sort of basically manipulate the supply of shipping, the flow of communications between continents and countries, to control and manipulate the flow of credit financing and of insurance for various cargoes, and of course the supply of coal, energy. What I'm saying is that Britain has a firm grip on the essential infrastructure underpinning the global trading system. And in addition to this, there is a very sophisticated understanding of how the world economy or the world economic system actually functions. And I could talk about that at some length, but I already notice eyes beginning to glaze over, so I'll stop talking economics. Now, these ideas are played around with by various officers in the Admiralty from 1901, 1902, 1903, but they really begin to take much closer look at them around about 1905. And by 1905, 1908, the Admiralty, who have come up with sort of what you might call an embryonic plan for economic warfare. And you might think this is somewhat unlikely, that a bunch of admirals are sponsoring the most sophisticated research into the workings of the global credit markets. And yet it is true. They were going to extraordinary rates. And you have this wonderful sight of admirals lecturing politicians on the vagaries of international finance. And I won't, anyway, I could go on at length. But anyways, and they presented this embryonic plan, went off slightly half-cocked around about late 1908 at the Casablanca, during the Casablanca crisis. And the politicians listened to this and went, well, this is very interesting, thank you very much, we'll take it under advisement. And very wisely, I think, that they decided that war was, in fact, too important to be left to the admirals. And so what they did is that the Liberal government of H.H. Asquith, in fact, conducts a number of investigations, Hardinge Committee, but culminating in something called the Desert Committee, which is a secret government committee set up in 1911. And representatives from all branches of the government participate, including 4 permanent secretaries. And anyone with an economic interest in the future of the country has a seat. And they've sifted and weigh all of these various options, and the Desert Committee comes to the conclusion that this economic warfare strategy really is quite viable. It's rather dangerous, and there are considerable concerns that this is an extremely dangerous two-edged sword, but they think that the idea of basically using the economic levers at Britain's disposal can be turned into a weapon. So in a sense, what I'm saying is that there is a strategic plan or policy plan, strategy, a grand strategy to weaponize the global trading system and turn it into a machine that's basically designed to basically intensify the economic pressures upon Germany at the outset of the war. hopefully to the extent that it will force Germany out of the war very, very quickly indeed. It's sometimes being compared. There's two phrases. It's somewhat one. I think David Showalter, you called it the British Schlieffen Plan, and then somebody else who was out in California came up with a very clever phrase. He called it Blitzkrieg, which I'm very impressed by, and I wish I'd thought about it myself. It would have made a much better title than having economic warfare, and doubtless would have sold a lot better. Anyway, the point is that this is the Desert Committee's recommendations are investigated. They're presented to the Committee of Imperial Defense, and they're authorized. The Prime Minister and the 8 senior members of the cabinet are there and present, and they could basically give the go-ahead for this economic warfare plan, pre-war. The most tangible demonstration of this is that they're actually, oh, and by the way, there's considerable active debate in this thing. So it isn't a question of a bunch of cabinet ministers having these 400-page report and going, yeah, right, I'm not reading this nonsense, whatever, I will agree whatever's decided. There's the diarists who are present, including quite junior secretaries, record in their diaries on that day that there is active discussion, very considerable, including the likes of David Lloyd George, discussing the pros and cons of this particular strategy. But as I say, the most active and tangible demonstration of that this was in fact adopted as policy is the pre-delegation of authority given by the government under the authority of the Privy Council to the Admiralty to act without further executive approval immediately upon declaration of war. They drafted up all these regulations. They drafted up all these powers that basically gave the Admiralty the authority immediately upon outbreak of war to take control of or exert control over international trade. They have the power to control communications, energy exports, exports, licenses, and direction of shipping, and various other little tricks. And remember, this is a liberal government that has authorized the military to intervene, not exactly laissez-faire, is it, to intervene in the active workings of not just the British, but the international economy itself. And so, as I say, my argument is that economic warfare is the cornerstone in 1914 of British war policy. It is the closest thing to a grand strategy they actually have in 1914. This is what actually happens. Is it put into effect in August 1914? Yes, it is. It goes immediately into effect, and it proves to be phenomenally successful. The problem is it's too successful. The war, as many people probably know, is accompanied by an economic collapse around the world. In the last 100 years, there have been 3 major economic collapses, and I'm sure you can all identify them, yes? What are they? In the last 100 years, 3 major economic collapses. We've got 2008, yes? Well, 29 or 31, absolutely right. And then the big one, what is the largest economic collapse of all in the last 100 years? 1914. I mean, all the stock exchanges around the world are shut. The foreign exchange system between countries has broken down. Everybody is flying out of US dollars. You can't change US dollars into anything. There is a grey market in exchange which, instead of trading at 486 par, you have to pay $6 US to buy 1 English pound. In the commodity markets, disintegration. I mean, cotton opens on 31st July at 12 3/4 in spot price, and within 72 minutes it's gone below 9, and New Orleans Exchange has shut its doors. Half the brokers are bankrupt, and by the way, the price of cotton goes on down below 6. Its wheat price is exactly the same thing, not quite as dramatic, but I could go on. The scale of economic chaos is quite extraordinary in 1914. And what is Britain doing? They're basically taking these war measures that are compounding the chaos. And the shrieks of outrage, mainly from British businesses, are really quite deafening. And you just read through the correspondence. Everybody is petitioning anybody, do we know anybody in the cabinet who could possibly help us out and, of course, stop this madness? And yes, a number of people did. So Herbert Samuel, his cousins are connected with Shell Oil, and Marcus Samuel, their merchant banking stepsister, they're all instantly write to their cousin in the cabinet saying, "What on earth do you think you're playing at? Stop this at once, please." Those who didn't have access to a cabinet minister or an MP would actually contact the Board of Trade. And the Board of Trade would, no question about it, were firmly against these lunatic ideas of economic warfare. People who didn't have domestic petitions, foreign interests, should we say, petition the Foreign Office. The point is that within a matter of days that it becomes rapidly apparent to the government that this may not be such a particularly good idea, or at least they might not, it's too successful and too many people are getting hurt. There is an intense cabinet debate that's basically forgotten between the 30th and 20th of August. Now, you think that there was when you remember that the decision to go to war in August 1914 nearly did bring down the Liberal government, even though they were, the prospect of being unemployed and losing their ministerial salaries persuaded most of them to stay on. A number did go, but that's nothing compared to the debate over economic warfare in the cabinet that occurs between 30th and 20th of August. Much, much more intense and passionate debate is going on there. And by the 20th of August, they in fact basically make a number of modifications to the economic warfare plan. The story, from 20th of August on, there is a steady series of diluting and making concessions and exceptions for various interest groups, until we get to about the 30th of October, by which time Woodrow Wilson has joined in. And I wouldn't say the United States is threatening war with Britain, but it's not far short. The economic impact of the controlled implosion of the world trading system it looks like the first economy to go down is probably the United States. And this is particularly worrying, well, certainly the southern US states. And of course, Woodrow Wilson is a Democrat, and he's got midterm elections coming up. How do you think he responds to the fact that cotton has just basically gone through the floor? You can't ship it overseas because British ships refuse to carry it. You can't insure it because even American insurers won't insure it because they can't lay off on Lloyd's of London. And of course, traders in New Orleans or even Galveston can't communicate to their buyers in Hamburg because British cable communications haven't severed the connection, but what they've done is that they're deliberately garbling the messages, which is an interesting... Anyway, that's for another day. The point is that by 30th of October, economic warfare strategy has collapsed. And what they've done is they've moved over to an extemporized sort of blockade policy, what is called, which is cobbled together at the last minute and doesn't work too well either. I suppose I would end on the note by saying this is quite an extraordinary thing. If you can call economic warfare a grand strategy or a strategic plan, it's possibly the only plan in history that has been called off just because it's too successful. And there I shall stop. Thank you.
And our third speaker is Sean McMeekin, who will swing us to the other side of Europe.
I hope to. Well, thank you, John, for that kind introduction earlier, and to Stephen for inviting me. And I think I actually have more cause than anyone for thanking Connie Hunter. Whether or not she actually would have been capable of bringing the First World War to a close by December 1914, she accommodated several rather elaborate flight changes on my part, a very long layover at JFK, a last-minute flight change, which in fact may even affect my future life course. And so I'm quite grateful to Connie. I suppose in some ways, while I do like to move the geography a bit further east, I'm also going to go back in the direction of some of the themes that Keith was raising earlier. Themes of contingency, accident, the play of personality, human agency in history, the lack of inevitability when you look at events. The one thing I think I would add, a theme that I am particularly keen on, is the importance of chronology and getting the dates right, because a lot can change in a day or even several hours or even minutes. By way of actually outlining this theme, I'd like to mention that I was recently in Australia, and it was literally en route to Australia. Not a week before I arrived, not 2 weeks before I arrived, But several days before I arrived, I received an email. I remember reading it, not least because I was actually in an airport lounge in Kuala Lumpur. I was about to board a flight on Malaysian Airlines out of Kuala Lumpur. Several days before a plane was hijacked out of Kuala Lumpur. This was quite far from my consciousness. I was not expecting my plane to be hijacked. Thankfully, my plane was not hijacked. For all I know, it may even have the same pilot as the plane which was hijacked, although that plane was going in a slightly different direction. Well, back to my story. I was reading an email from the moderator of the panel, rather like, we have John right here, the man who was supposed to introduce us, and he was saying, well, look, I'd like you all to try to make this relevant. I was going to be on a panel with Margaret Macmillan and Paul Ham about the outbreak of the First World War. He said, so think about contemporary parallels, what's going on in the world today, he said. I want you maybe to think about the Senkaku Islands dispute and whether it's possible that a war might break out between China and Japan. Was China like a rising imperial Germany? Was the United States like a declining Britain? This was obviously what people were talking about several weeks ago, apparently. Now, in between receiving this email and actually having the panel, Russia's incursion into the Crimea broke out. Now, it's interesting that as little as about 72 hours, I think it was a bit long, maybe 96 hours before our panel happened, no one was talking about Crimea. And now last week, I have CNN contacting me wanting me to explain the Crimean War to them. So it just shows you how little we really know about the future. I mean, if we really did understand the future, I suppose we would not be historians. We might be commodities traders. We might be making a great fortune in the markets. So bringing this back then to the larger debates about the First World War, what I might add to Keith Neilson's rather elegant outline of, I think, some of the misconceptions in the standard chronology. You don't even have to go back to the 20s. You can go back to the 60s, the high Cold War era, to see the, I think, the elaborate architecture of explanation around these structural forces. And obviously in the Cold War, alliance systems seemed rather compelling. We had two rather large alliances, rather heavily armed, and always arming themselves further, so the importance of arms races was also taken for granted. Now, the way I think this spilled over into the literature, we had books like A.G.B. Taylor with War by Timetable. There was also the Fisher debate, which had to do with all these grand German plans, which were kind of set in stone, and there was some plan cocked in, I suppose, 1912 to launch a world war. In more recent literature, there's actually a book by Alan Massey, this bestseller, this rather punctually titled Dreadnought. Now, of course, Dreadnought posits that there was kind of this inexorably growing tension between Britain and Germany, the arms race, the alliances that was kind of fated to lead to this cataclysmic conflict. And it's a wonderful book. He's a great storyteller. But it's interesting, just a couple of days ago, I was in Leipzig. I think a bit like Hugh Strachan, I'm getting around a lot this month. I was in Leipzig over the weekend, and my own panel host in Leipzig had done his Promotionsarbeit on the British-German press war before the First World War. Out of curiosity, I just said, well, so where did you bracket the story on the British-German press war before the First World War? And he said, well, I brought it up to 1911, with kind of an epilogue in 1912. Because it was over by 1912, because Britain and Germany were no longer conducting a press war, and because the naval race was basically over, and more or less the British had won, and as Keith was pointing out, the Germans were looking at other things because they had basically realized they could not compete, they could not afford both the army and the navy, so it really was not part of the story. I think an even more dramatic example of this in the literature, although it's less the academic literature than the popular literature, is Barbara Tuchman's book, The Guns of August, which again, like Massey's, is a very elegant chronicle. She's a great storyteller. There's several peculiarities in this book, though, which really strike us today if you read the book closely. One is, of course, that she told the story of the outbreak of the First World War while leaving out Austria, Hungary, and Serbia. Deliberately. She actually says she's going to do this because it would add tiresome length to her narrative. She also skips the July crisis. I don't mean she skips over it in 5 pages. She skips over it in a paragraph. She just does not tell the story of the July crisis. It's just not there. Sarajevo is just not there. It's not part of her story. That tells you something about, I think, what people were thinking about the war about a half century ago. Structural alliance systems and, all the rest of it. Well, I think we have learned a lot. I mean, recent literature doesn't necessarily parrot those old cliches. Sometimes revisionism, as I think we were just told, can be taken too far. I'm thinking of the book by David Fromkin, not his Peace to End All Peace, but the Europe's Last Summer book. And he has an interesting metaphor. He calls it clear air turbulence, that what happened in 1914 was a bit like an airplane which is going along smoothly, and then suddenly, without warning, the plane is kind of jumping all over the place, and everyone is panicking and hoping that they still have their seatbelts on, and their heads are bashing against the walls in the bathroom. There was just no prelude, there was no warning of conflict. Europe was sailing along in the long peace, globalization of trade, liberalization of the world economy, and all the rest of it, and then suddenly it's kind of wrenched out of joint. Well, there's something to be said for the before and after effect. It's a bit like those weight loss commercials, where you have this elaborately overweight person and then, suddenly they're fitting it into a leotard, after the event. You can take that too far, particularly in 1914. I suppose for my generation, the touchstone is 9/11. We saw how the world of geopolitics changed suddenly on 9/11. I was actually in New York on Bleecker Street on 9/11. My own story is rather lame, though. I actually slept through it. And my sister actually woke me up on the phone, and told me the World Trade Center was on fire. And I looked out the window, and, well, I couldn't see the World Trade Center. I was on Bleecker Street, a lot of buildings. I was a bit shocked by it. I obviously wasn't expecting it, nor was anyone else. I remember what the newspapers were talking about right before 9/11. They're talking about shark attacks in Florida. There was a spate of them, apparently. In New York, everyone was talking about a scandal involving a Little League baseball pitcher who had falsified his age documents. He was pitching in the 12 and unders, and I think he was actually about 15. And that's what people were talking about. They obviously weren't talking about Islamic terrorism. They weren't talking about Osama bin Laden. I suppose they might have been if they'd been paying attention to events in the 90s. But that is, history can change on a dime. It can change very quickly. I don't actually see where the pointer is. Does anyone have the pointer? Has it been looking on perhaps I can do it on the screen. We had a pointer here earlier. Oh, here it is. Right, so let's see if I can activate my map here. Trying to turn this on. All right, well, I don't have the map. You can just imagine here a map of the Balkans. If we have some tech support, perhaps they could come up. The computer might have gone into sleep mode, I suppose, since it hasn't been doing anything. Oh, here we go. So I think we have to reactivate the computer first, and perhaps then we can bring up our map. There we go. Okay. So here we have our map of the Balkans. So what I'd like to do briefly is bring you back to the world of June 27th, as we might call it. That is to say, a bit like people talked about 9/10 after 9/11, we have here the world of June 27th. It's not a particularly peaceful world. If you're looking at this part of the world, there have been 3 wars in the previous 3 years. Italy had invaded Tripoli, of course, in 1911. Interesting contemporary parallel. The most savage fighting actually occurred in the suburbs of Benghazi, which is where both Mustafa Kemal, future Ataturk, and Enver Bey, future Pasha, actually saw their first really serious battlefield action. It was in the course of this war, that Turkey discovered, because both of them had actually gotten there, incognito by way of disguise, because they had to go in by way of British Egypt, essentially as civilians, because the Ottomans discovered they had no naval carrying capacity. The Italians had utter and total, nearly uncontested control of the eastern Mediterranean, and they started picking off islands down here, the so-called Dodecanese Islands. It was in the course of this war and discovering their kind of naval impotence that the Ottomans had for the very first time actually closed the straits, including to Russian shipping, thus dealing a very serious blow to Russia's economic interests, particularly regarding exports and imports and so on. Piggybacking on this conflict, of course, the Balkan League of Serbia, Greece, Bulgaria, Montenegro had then declared war on the Ottoman Empire and began carving up the eastern provinces. Mustafa Kemal was actually somewhat horrified to discover that he was actually stuck in Benghazi when Salonika, his hometown and birthplace, was overrun. Interestingly, the Greeks beat the Bulgarians there by about 24 hours, which is why it's called Thessaloniki today and not whatever the Bulgarians would have called it. I actually would have to imagine what the Bulgarians might have called it. But this is actually what was, of course, in the air. I mean, war was in the air. You actually had huge movements of refugees. Obviously, you have mostly Muslims going this way. You have a few Christians going this way, because of the ethnic cleansing unleashed by the war. The Hagia Sophia, the Hagia Sophia, has been turned into a cholera infirmary. So Istanbul is something like a refugee camp or a way station for all these nomadic Muslim refugees. Not unlike my own wife's family, actually. They were expelled from Bulgaria in 1989. My wife actually was clever enough to ensure that several of the books were removed from the car, her parents' books, and she replaced them with her toys. So she actually got to escape with her toys. But that's what was going on. People were loading up, kind of ox carts and so on with their personal possessions. And they're all arriving down here, and this is causing havoc. It's causing chaos because Turkey was not exactly, of course, a haven for what we might call kind of tolerance and understanding between Muslims and Christians. There were good periods and there were bad periods, and this was a bad period. Tensions were rising. There were stories of the mistreatment of Greek Christian nationals in Asia Minor, particularly around, I can't even actually read this map. I hope you can kind of figure out where I'm talking about. But okay, there we are, Smyrna. Smyrna, today's Izmir. There are all kinds of stories percolating around about atrocities being committed against Greek Christians. Some of them by angry or jealous Muslim neighbors, some of them by recent refugees who've just arrived. And so now we come forward to the world of June 27th. The recent events included an ultimatum dispatched from Athens to Constantinople on the 12th, essentially saying, well, I'm actually going to tell you what it says because I scribbled it down on a piece of paper here. It said that, there must be an end to the persecution of the Greeks of Asia Minor, or else serious consequences will ensue, i.e. warfare. The reason this was actually particularly serious, mind you, and the clock was ticking, is that the Ottomans, after discovering their naval impotence, particularly in the war with Italy, had placed orders for state-of-the-art dreadnoughts being constructed in British yards. The first of those, having been renamed the Sultan Osman I, was expected to arrive in Istanbul, Constantinople, in July 1914. The Greeks confusing things somewhat in another direction, despite the fact that if you've read one of my books, The Berlin-Baghdad Express, you know about the Kaiser's enthusiasm for Turkey and for Islam. His sister was also, of course, Queen of Greece. And in fact, King Constantine was famously something of a Germanophile, partly for that reason. And so the Greeks had actually ordered their own dreadnoughts from Germany, but they were not expected to arrive until 1915. Russia, forbidden by the Straits Conventions, the most recent iteration of which dated to the Berlin Treaty of 1878, was not allowed to import or export warships or send them in any manner whatsoever through the Straits. So the Russians had to build their own dreadnoughts in the Black Sea to counter the Ottoman naval buildup. They were not expecting to float their first operational dreadnought, that is, it would not become operational until about the end of 1915 at the earliest, and more realistically, 1916. And so the clock is ticking. The Ottomans are about to acquire their first dreadnought. And in fact, there are no dreadnoughts in the Greek fleet or the Russian Black Sea fleet. And so the clock is ticking. You actually have a kind of panic mode. The Russians, after having seen the Straits close once before, are in a panic mode. There's actually an urgent query sent by the ambassador Mikhail Girs to Sazonov on the 15th of June, saying that Russia must be prepared to launch, quote, immediate measures, presumably to secure the Bosporus, or at the very least to prevent the Turks from closing the Straits again. So, what everyone is expecting and what the chancelleries of Europe and the foreign offices are all focusing on June 27th is, of course, the Third Balkan War, which is about to break out between Turkey and Greece. Now, this is actually the only area in which I differ from, it's not really a difference, but something that Keith kind of earlier was hinting. Why did Sarajevo not lead to a Third Balkan War? And that's something you sometimes see in the literature. My own view is that Sarajevo actually prevented the Third Balkan War from breaking out. So in fact, that was the most likely scenario if you're simply looking at the kind of the pace of events and so on. And there are all kinds of things which might have happened. There would have been obviously violence. Bulgaria might have tried to make good its losses in the Second Balkan War. Russia might have mobilized its Black Sea fleet. There might have been contingency measures. I actually think one of the likely scenarios in this world, the world of June 27th, was for this war to break out and for a conference to be held, probably hosted by Sir Edward Grey in London yet again, as he had hosted a conference in the First Balkan War. Russia, in this case, of a war between Turkey and Greece, had absolutely no interest in exacerbating or prolonging. In fact, they would have wanted to put the kibosh on it immediately to make sure the straits were not closed. So there may even have been something of a revival of the concert of Europe, at least in spirit, as Europe was united in outrage and horror at these new atrocities being committed, this new outbreak of violence between Muslim and Christians, Turkey and Greece, and this might have actually led to not exactly peace and nirvana, but obviously something very different from what we actually got in 1914. Well, instead this happened. Well, this happened, right? You have, the 28th of June. Okay, so now we're in the world of 28th of June. Now, of course, if you actually go off this map, you go outside Sarajevo, you would notice in the 28th of June, that the Serbs were actually reenacting, the great battle, or at least the climax of the Battle of Kosovo Polje down, in Kosovo in Blackbird Field. This being the battle when the Serbian nation had been extinguished, but when famously Miloš Obilić, had slain the Sultan, Murad. And they were actually reenacting the slaying of a sultan, now dressed up in Austro-Hungarian garb, when several Serbian terrorists actually, of course, succeeded in assassinating Archduke Franz Ferdinand. What's interesting, though, of course, and the real aficionados here know the story, that it's actually a little bit more complicated. Yeah, you have 7 assassins on the K, so that would suggest a plot, a conspiracy. Yes, that's true. That would suggest certain structural factors you have to look at. Yes, that's true. On the other hand, the first guys in line, Mehmet Bacic, he was the token Muslim. He was recruited as window dressing. Čabrilović, he was also a local recruit, and neither of them actually raised a finger. Čabrinović was the key man of the hour. He was number 3, the only one who had been trained and armed in Belgrade. He actually, of course, took out a fuse bomb, and he threw it at the Archduke, and naturally, of course, he hit him in the face. And it grazed off his cheek, and he was actually injured, in a kind of a small way. He had a scratch. His wife was actually injured, I think, they were kind of like a little bit of movement in the car. And it detonated behind the staff car behind, and a couple of people were injured, including Lieutenant Colonel Meritzi. And, then the world continued on its course, and the Third Balkan War broke out. Except that's not actually what happened. What did happen is that they continued on their way, and they gave a bunch of boring speeches down at town hall, and the mayor, who was actually Muslim, Fahim Effendi, he hadn't actually prepared for the contingency of events. So he's actually reading out his kind of boring, pre-prepared. The people of Sarajevo, as you can see, Your Highness, have welcomed you here, and the people love you, and they're so happy to. And then, the Archduke, are you joking? They just threw a bomb at me. And they were all a little bit ticked off, so obviously they changed the plan. And they had about 3 or 4 different possibilities. They could have gone back to the original program, which basically would have been to go to the museum, this way. They could have cut off the program and gone here to the Konak, which you can see this big mosque here. The reason I put that on the map is not just because it's there, but to show this is the Muslim quarter, which was, of course, much safer than the Serbian quarter. So they actually would have just had to cross the Kaiser Bridge, straight shot, go back to lunch, go back to Vienna, everything's normal. Third Balkan War breaks out a few days later. No, instead, actually, the Archduke himself, personally, one man made the decision. The decision was, no, I'll do neither. I'm actually going to go back to the garrison hospital, to visit the wounded Lieutenant Colonel Meritzi. So they're actually supposed to go like this. They reconfigure the motorcade, because they realized Franz Josef's Strasse was a little bit iffy. It was a little bit dicey because, right there you've got this narrow street, lots of crowds milling around, could be a terrorist, who knows. And so they're actually supposed to just go barreling down here. They're supposed to reach full speed, kind of like hit about 4th or 5th gear, by the time they get here. Just hitting about 40, 50 kilometers an hour. Now, interestingly, we know that Princip was here. His original position, he had moved across to the Spice Emporium. He was not exactly a Marine sniper, okay? He had washed out of military training because he was sickly, and he actually died before the First World War because he was such bad health. He was not exactly a crack shot, right? So, the odds of him getting off a kill shot, the car moving at about 40 kilometers an hour, 50 maybe by about this point, were pretty low. Of course, what actually happened is that the first car in the motorcade, the driver took a wrong turn, turned right, thinking they were actually going by the original itinerary. Second driver followed him. Third driver, who had the Archduke, military governor, Paciorek, and of course also Franz Ferdinand's wife, he turned right too, but there you actually had a man in the car, Paciorek, who knew about the new route, and so he just barked at the driver. He said, you got to turn the car around. And it was while he was literally fidgeting around with the car's gearbox that Governor Princip saw his target standing right in front of him, stepped into point-blank range and fired those shots. The shots which altered the course of world history. I firmly believe that. Well, not just because, we might have had a Third Balkan War otherwise. Now, if you look at, the mobilization maps and, all of this is actually important, and so if I have time, I'll actually talk a little bit about the mobilization plans. But I want to skip ahead because I realize there are some time constraints, because I like the zoom lens, and so I'll skip very, very quickly over Austria's dilemmas. You have obviously Konrad von Hitzendorf, chief of the general staff, who had been wanting to go to war with Serbia for years. He kept being basically scotched by Franz Ferdinand himself, who kept saying, no, we must not go to war with Serbia, that's really stupid. Not because he liked Serbs, incidentally. It's also true of the Hungarian minister-president, István Tiza. It's because they hated Serbs. You know, they thought it was really stupid to go to war with Serbia because, like, you already have enough Serbs. Why do you want more of them? You know, it's a pretty good argument, you know, and eventually this argument, of course, loses to the other argument, which is, well, we're all so angry and everyone's laughing at us, and we're sort of the laughingstock of Europe, and we've got to do something, you know, to restore our status, etc. You know, so we know what happens, right? They get the backing of the Germans. It takes about 4 weeks to get their act together, partly because of the harvest leave. They send this ultimatum to Serbia and so on. Now, I want to skip ahead a little bit past the ultimatum because the period that I really like, as far as my favorite dates in the July crisis, is right about between, let's say, like the 27th, 28th, and 29th of July. What's so fascinating about this period is some of doomsday, the doomsday machine, has already kind of sort of been set into motion. You know, already on the 25th, both Austria-Hungary and Serbia have started mobilizing. Although Serbia is actually in some ways a little bit faster than Austria-Hungary. The Austro-Hungarians are always just, you know, kind of behind the eight ball. They're really slow. Russia's inaugurating its period preparatory to war. There are various hints coming out of Russia that some kind of secret mobilization is underway, but no one quite knows the nature of it yet. Now, on the 26th of July, which was a Sunday, the Austro-Hungarians tell the German ambassador, they're trying to tell him what's going on. The Germans have been asking all month. The whole point of the blank check was to get them to do something, right? So what are you doing? You know, they ask them. And here's what the Austrians actually tell the Germans. They say, well, we're going to be ready to invade Serbia by about the 12th of August. That's actually what the Germans have just heard from Vienna on Sunday. The Austrians will be ready to move in about 2 weeks. Okay. So the next day, the Kaiser famously, returns back to Potsdam. The Chancellor meets him on the train. It's Bethmann Hollweg. Now we're on Monday. Okay, and so Bethmann Hollweg, the Chancellor, by now he kind of realizes things are going wrong. You know, the Austrians haven't gotten their act together. There are now hints that Britain may be leaning towards giving diplomatic support to France and Russia. No one knows, as Keith has just told you, what Britain's going to do, least of all, of course, the British cabinet. The Germans are becoming a little worried, though, and it's clear that the Austrians have royally screwed up. You know, they screwed up all of the sequence. They sent the ultimatum before they sent the dossier outlining Serbia's guilt in the crime. You know, so it just basically made them look stupid. Obviously, they had not convinced anyone, least of all, I mean, the Russians didn't want to be convinced anyway, but they obviously hadn't convinced anyone in London or Paris that, that there really was a real story behind Serbian complicity in the crime. So anyway, Bethmann realized, look, his whole policy is in ruins, basically. And he more or less offers to resign. So we have another moment here where you have either one man or two men determining the course of events. And the Kaiser, quite elegantly tells him, no, you've cooked up this broth yourself. Now you will eat it. Okay, so he does not allow the Chancellor to resign. Now, admittedly, the pressure of events would have made it, a huge crisis had he resigned, and so you could see the argument for keeping him on. But in fact, Bethmann wanted to resign. He didn't really want to be at the center of events. His wife had just died. He was really depressed. He wasn't sleeping well. And things are just going really badly. The Germans are just basically inept, in the way they played all the diplomacy. He basically just wants to get out of Dodge. He wants to resign. Kaiser does not let him. The very next day, on Tuesday morning, the Kaiser, partly because the Chancellor and obviously the military staff chiefs and so on, they actually didn't really want the Kaiser to read Serbia's reply because they knew he was really impulsive and he would sometimes have these strange, kind of like sudden enthusiasms for various things he had read. Serbia's reply was actually very cleverly worded. Basically what it said, instead of expressing a formal public apology, they basically said, we regret that you have accused us of this crime. If you actually read the terms of it, it's not an apology at all, and they're really not accepting the terms. But they made it sound enough like, it was like debasing and humiliating enough that it sounded like it was a diplomatic victory. And the Kaiser reads this, and he says, look, hey, we've won! This is great! Halt in Belgrade, just, I don't know, have some symbolic, Belgrade, by the way, is right on the border. We'll have to go back to our Balkan map then briefly. Belgrade being right on the border here, boy, it's really not very easy to see on this map. There we go. Okay, Belgrade is right on the border of Austria-Hungary. I mean, they can basically reach it, with their artillery without even, obviously crossing the border. So you shell Belgrade, maybe the Serbs. In fact, the Serbs were planning to evacuate Belgrade, more or less, at the start of the war, to declare it, more or less an open city. And so, sure, you occupy Belgrade, you negotiate, you allow the Serbs, to save some face, the Austrians to save some face, This is the so-called halt in Belgrade plan that the Kaiser favors. Unfortunately, he was not in the habit of using the phone. And so he expressed his intention to defuse the crisis and basically tell the Austro-Hungarians to kind of back down and start negotiating with Serbia over the terms of the ultimatum. This instruction, it was also because he went for a staff ride on a horse right after he woke up. So he was just a couple of hours too late, because by the time this message reached first the Chancellor, then was decoded, sent on to the Austrians, the Austro-Hungarians had just declared war on Serbia. By telegram, in French, this was Berthold's doing. This is the Austro-Hungarian foreign minister. Now, why he did this is still something of a mystery, because the big belligerent man, the warmonger, supposedly was Konrad von Hötzendorf, and he had just said we shouldn't declare war on Serbia because that's really stupid. Japan had not declared war on Russia in 1904. Now, there were very good strategic reasons for not showing your hand too early. It was a little bit like, I think it's actually Keith who said this last night. We were in the hotel bar, and he had this great idea. It was like going up to someone in a bar and saying, hey, I'd like to punch you. Right? Now, why he did this, my own theory, and admittedly I can't prove this, is that basically he did it against the advice of his own military, because he didn't want to answer his phone anymore, because everyone just kept bombarding him with these mediation plans, and he was just sick of it, He was just sick of it. Everyone is just pressuring him, and obviously he wants a war with Serbia. There's no mystery about that. He doesn't want to hear it anymore. He doesn't want to hear 4 power plants. He doesn't want to hear 2 power plants. He doesn't want to hear talk to Belgrade. He doesn't want to hear what the Russians. He's just sick of it. So he says, declare war now, and I won't have to talk to anyone anymore. You have a mediation plan? Oh, too bad, we're at war. Sorry, right? And what's so curious about this is that when Pasic, the Serbian prime minister, actually received this telegram, he was really confused because it was so stupid and it made no sense. He actually sent an urgent query to Paris, London, and Petersburg, basically saying, I got this really weird telegram, from Vienna. They say they're at war with us. Can you make sense of this? Well, he couldn't. There's no shelling. Nothing was actually happening, but Austro-Hungary had just, declared war on Serbia. Oops. Well, now the Germans are really in a pickle. So we're going to go forward to the next day, the 29th. I think it's my single favorite day of the July crisis. We go forward to the 29th. I have to tell, the first part of the story because it happens first. The Austro-Hungarians, just to show everyone that they weren't joking, they began a kind of desultory shelling of Belgrade, that afternoon. Now this desultory shelling of Belgrade on the afternoon of the 29th of July, Wednesday, 29 July 1914, is what actually gave Russia the mobilization, the casus belli, to order general mobilization that night. The Tsar actually signed the orders on the 29th of July for general mobilization. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. It meant war. He understood this quite well, in fact. I know that he understood this well, because an hour later, he changed his mind. Okay? He changed his mind because he had just gotten a telegram from the Kaiser, the so-called Willy Nicky correspondence, because they actually did write in English. And a lot of these letters, most of them are actually online. It's a lot of fun. You can just go read them. But the sequence is vital, because in fact, the Tsar thought the Kaiser was replying to a telegram he had just sent an hour ago, talking about mediation and a Hague conference. And so he was really moved. He thought the Kaiser was calling off the dogs of war, so he himself called off the dogs of war, and he literally had the general who was in charge of directing the mobilization orders at the Central Telegraph Office called to the phone and told to stop the order from going out to all of Russia's provincial military centers. He was wrong. In fact, the Kaiser was replying to a telegram he had sent about 24 hours ago, because things didn't actually work that quickly. And if you were thinking clearly, you would have noticed the Kaiser had not mentioned the Hague conference. He was actually talking about yesterday's news. So he was actually confused, but he's also moved. And as he said, apparently to an aide, I do not want to be responsible for a monstrous slaughter. So the Tsar changed his mind. Now, if we go back to Berlin that very night, Bethmann Hollweg, who is now, again, he's kind of desperate. He's panicking. He's not sleeping. He's really just out of sorts. He's not thinking clearly at all. He calls in Goschen, the British ambassador. It's about 10 p.m., so it's also pretty late at night. And by now he's really desperate because he's heard all of this news about Russia's mobilization measures. Obviously, Austria has just upped the ante by shelling Belgrade. He's desperate to get an across-the-board pledge of British neutrality. This has been the holy grail for Bethmann Hollweg. His whole policy is rapprochement with Britain. It now looks like it may go up in flames, so he's desperate. And so he conducts what I call an act of diplomatic striptease. He literally starts revealing the secrets of Germany's military plan involving Belgium, basically because he just couldn't keep his mouth shut. You know, he kept saying, please be neutral, and Gosh would say, well, what can you tell me? Do you plan to attack France? Well, if things come to a pass, then it might come to war, you know, etc. Well, so do you plan to take France's colonies? You know, he actually keeps answering these questions. That was really amazing. You know, they finally get to Belgium. Actually, he had one thing that he was actually able to answer honestly. He was asked whether Germany would invade Dutch territory as well. That had been Schlieffen's original intention in the so-called Schlieffen Plan, which had been somewhat modified by Moltke, and now had to basically pound through the edge, and, you know, without violating Dutch territory, partly for economic reasons, that they wanted to be able to have some markets open for world trade. So he was able to say, oh, thank God, yes, I promise we're not going to invade Holland. Okay, I promise. When it came to Belgium, though, you know, he basically kind of indirectly admitted by saying, well, I can promise you that we will respect Belgium's territorial integrity at the end of the war. Well, you know, when the British cabinet actually read this, they actually felt sorry for Bethmann. The word, I think it might have been, it was either Eric Crow or maybe Sir Arthur Nicholson, you know, who minuted all this. There's something childlike about German diplomacy. They're just idiots. You know, they're sort of children. And what's so fascinating about this is that in addition to the fact that he's now given as much ammunition as possible to anyone in the British cabinet who does want to favor an interventionist policy. Now, in addition to that, Bethmann had done this several minutes before he received the latest telegram from Sir Edward Grey. And here's what it said. Now, in his classically elliptical style, you know, Sir Edward Grey had told Lichnowsky, Prince Lichnowsky, the German ambassador in London, that, you know, in case it came to war on the continent, we might be forced into taking rapid decisions. In this case, it would not do to stand aside and wait. Well, it doesn't sound like much, but this is the first hint Sir Edward Grey had even given to the Germans that Britain was even thinking about going to war. You know, until then, admittedly, maybe he should have been thinking more clearly, but Bethmann really did seem to think Britain would stay out. The reason this mattered, we can actually trace this through the diplomatic correspondence. Because after he received this message from London, shortly after his 10 p.m. meeting with the British ambassador, when he had exposed the deepest secret of German war plans in this act of diplomatic striptease, he actually sent 2 urgent telegrams to Vienna. The first of them basically outlined, you know, the latest thing, the conversation with Goschen, and the fact that all this business had happened, but then that he had heard this warning from London that Britain might actually fight. And so what he told his own ambassador in Vienna, Czerski, was that he must urge the government of Austria-Hungary emphatically and urgently to accept 4-power mediation with Serbia. Now, a day before, it is true, Bethmann had actually been, to some extent, that is less peace-minded than the Kaiser. He'd actually watered down the Kaiser's halt in Belgrade proposal. That is, on Tuesday, Bethmann had said that no, the Austrians should not back down. They should negotiate, but they should not offer any concessions. Now he says, unequivocally, that they must accept 4-power mediation with Serbia. He has literally changed his mind because of Sir Edward Grey's telegram, which he received obviously a little bit too late, both for his meeting with Goschen and for another reason, which of course I'll remind you of in a moment. His second telegram was a little bit more desperate and emotional, as befits a man in a panic, at about 2 or 3 in the morning. And this is what Bethmann Hollweg said, and I quote, "We must decline to let ourselves be dragged by Vienna wantonly and without regard to our advice into a world conflagration." Bethmann Hollweg rescinded the blank check to Vienna at about 3 a.m. on the night of 29-30 July 1914. Interesting because, of course, about 12 hours prior to this, the Austro-Hungarians had begun shelling Belgrade. So it was, depending on your reckoning of time, perhaps 14 hours, 16 hours, a day or two too late. Had Sir Edward Grey summoned the courage or the fortitude, or perhaps been a little bit more confident of support in the cabinet, which obviously he was not, Had he warned Bethmann as much as a day or 2 or 3 previously, the blank check to Vienna might have been rescinded before war was declared on Belgrade. This is a big if, obviously. Now I'm going to bring the scene back to St. Petersburg, and I'm going to bring in Paris very briefly before I close. This is, again, partly to kind of problematize some of our notions about both responsibility for the war and also what we might call intentions of various statesmen. Even as the German chancellor, in emotional desperation, is rescinding the blank check to Serbia, everyone in Petersburg has gone into something like a panic mode for a different reason, because the Tsar, if you remember, had just changed his mind, rescinded the order for general mobilization, and they wanted him to, of course, basically put it back. What Sazonov wired to his ambassador in Paris that very night, this is to Izvolsky, is that, quote, "As we are unable to accede to Germany's desire that Russia cease mobilizing, it only remains for us to hasten our armaments and regard war as imminent." After he received this telegram, Izvolsky then woke up most of the French government. If you've read Barbara Tuchman's book, you might recognize the scene where everyone wakes them up in the middle of this great line, and, "Oh, God, these Russians, they're even worse insomniacs than they are drinkers." Yeah, they wake up the French in the middle of the night. The problem with Tuchman's account is she gets the date wrong by 2 days. It did not happen on Friday after Germany had sent her ultimatums to Paris and Petersburg. It happened on Wednesday in response to Russia's declaration, the same declaration, incidentally, which is made in person that very night by Sazonov to the German ambassador Portalis, which is also made that very night in the Tsar's second telegram to Kaiser Wilhelm II, when he actually confessed that Russia had actually undertaken mobilization measures 5 days previously. Anyway, so when the French have this meeting, they, of course, have to discuss what to do. What to do is largely to massage the situation so the British don't suspect that Russia has already moved to general mobilization, which technically they don't actually do until the next afternoon at about 4 p.m., but that's because it took them that long to badger the Tsar into doing it. But the decision had already been made. The French then had to simply massage the truth, so that they could make sure that no one suspected in London that Russia had already ordered general mobilization. So if we come back to this day, we can see all kinds of alternative possibilities depending on not just the personality and intentions of the statesman, but in some cases based on the contingency of even communication, the contingency of course, personality and temperament, but also what people knew or thought they knew and when they knew it. That in fact nothing was actually foreordained to happen, that the interplay of chance, personality, communications, accident, and in the end, I suppose, you have to look at the actions of these individuals. There are always choices, and I would like to end right there.
We have a few minutes left for questions, if there are any. I guess we just take them sitting down. So.
Can I ask you a question, Keith? I'm especially interested in this British and French division of naval labor. 1912.
Yep.
Yeah. Wasn't that really kind of a game changer for Britain in the event of a continental war? Because if France went down, then the Mediterranean spread out into India. So didn't that raise the stakes for Britain in the case of any general European war?
Well, there was certainly a great deal of debate in Britain about whether or not they should take naval forces out of the Mediterranean. There are all kinds of arguments that that was a bad idea. But essentially, so how many ships do you have available to do everything? You have worldwide responsibilities. The argument is that it would be much worse if the Germans were able to bombard the Channel ports and take them over than it would be if eventually the Germans got around to the Mediterranean. And how would German ships get to the Mediterranean to cause trouble for the British without coming through the Channel? And they could stop them then. So if the French look after the Mediterranean, according to the 1912 agreement, this is really quite an unnecessary step in some ways. And it allows the British to put the fleet where they feel it'll do the most good. It'll cover not only the Mediterranean indirectly, but it'll also certainly cover the important parts of the Channel and the North Sea for the British. So, you'd probably be better to ask Nick about this, who knows a great deal more than I do about British naval policy.
Probably talk about it later, because I could talk forever about that. Yeah, I would argue it's essentially a political arrangement, not an operational planning one. But I would explain that afterwards if you like.
No.
Sorry?
What was support like for the radical faction in Britain at this time?
They have about 60 seats in where the Liberal government has a majority of far less than 60. After the second election in 1910, I was trying to remember, it's something like 25 or 30. So if the radical faction, which is regional in its composition for the most part, if either they or the Irish faction drop out, the Liberal government has no majority whatsoever. So small in numbers, large in influence, as it would be. And many of the people who are radicals joined the Labour Party after the war. There's, if you identify all the radicals of 1910 and see what happens to them after the First World War, they're to be found mostly in the Labour Party as a result of things.
Hugh Strawn had
a question for Nick. One of the things that's always intrigued me about the presumption of short war is that it's very clearly there in French and Russian thinking. That is, de Castenau, for example, as Vice Chief of the General Staff, says the war will be short precisely because of the arguments that you produce, and so does Samsonov. So there's this expectation of economic warfare there. And the question is really, and it links it back in part to Keith's argument, how far you think there's communication about the notion of economic war to potential allies? I mean, or is it simply in the air and therefore an expectation? But the fact you can have both a Russian foreign minister and a French deputy chief of the general staff clearly saying, there will be widespread economic collapse because of British economic warfare, and therefore the war will be short, suggests some degree of coordination on it.
There are two sets of forces in play. I mean, first of all, there is the general expectation of economic collapse in the event of a major conflict. This is pretty much generally assumed. It's to a remarkable degree across Europe. One thing that struck me is looking at diaries. Everywhere you're seeing reference to 1848 in August 1940. They're all harking back to 1848. And so, in a sense, yes, that there would be a general economic collapse in the event of a major European war was pretty much widely recognized and indeed assumed. And in fact, that's the point I want to make, is that economic warfare is predicated upon this belief and assumption. And so, in a sense, what they're attempting to do is to exacerbate the problem deliberately, to channel, if you like. I mean, the best analogy I can think of is it's the world. I mean, there's a volcanic eruption, if you were. It's the world economic system is going to erupt. Now, you cannot stop the flow of lava, but you can channel it. And I think that's what they believed that they were going to do, that they were going to channel the flows of economic lava towards the enemy and away from themselves. But from the beginning, they recognized that what they were doing is extremely dangerous, and everybody, all sides are going into the abyss, and it's a question of who's going to hit bottom first. In fact, that's what Desart says in his remarks to the chairman of Bering Banks. Does it not come down to this? We're all going to suffer horribly in this war. It's the question who can last longer. That's the question. Now, in terms of the second part of your question is to what extent Britain communicated their intentions to France and to Russia. I am doubtful that they did. because, number one, they were not particularly keen on I mean, this is a Liberal government after all. They're not particularly keen on telling their own party what they're intending to do. In fact, one of the arguments for economic warfare debated in the Desert Committee in 1912 is they said this is an enormous deterrence. Because we're talking about here, economic warfare is not a precision weapon, and it was recognized as such. It's a weapon of mass destruction. And as such, it makes a rather good deterrent. There's an active debate among various people in the British government and connected with in British government circles at this time, is that do we want to proclaim what our intention is as a form of deterrence against war? The problem is that it requires the Liberal government to say is we're going to endorse active state intervention into shipping industry, into the financial services industry, in terms of, and in censorship of communication, opening people's mail. This list is enough to make any Liberal politician turn white. There is no way they're going to disclose this to their own party. So I would think that they didn't communicate the intentions, how they were going to do it, or the way they believed it would work to their allies. The only qualification is this question of what happened in 1911. Harold James has suggested that there was communication between Britain and France in bringing the Second Agadir crisis to an end. There appears to have been some actions to attack Germany financially that had some effect, but to what extent the effort is concerted, I don't know.
Could I make a small qualification just from the Russian side? I don't know whether there was deliberate explanatory communication from the British to the Russians about any grand plan, but you do see in some of the Russian documents and even the newspapers in early August 1914 a very general notion that Britain is going to strangle Germany economically. That is, that Germany will not be able to fight for very long. There may not be a sophisticated grasp of why this is or what Britain's plan is, but the Russians do at least talk about it.
Jim.
I'm a political scientist, so it's probably appropriate for me to play the devil's advocate's role here. And it's sort of in response to some of the comments about structure and its role. First off, structure doesn't have to operate in a deterministic fashion. You could imagine the structure affects before World War I as being sloping everybody down towards war. And if you slip, you can slide easily into war, which doesn't eliminate contingency. It just means that structure sort of operating in combination with contingency or decision-making or at the actor level. The other thing about there was some discussion about alliances and that there weren't any legal commitments or written commitments for them to act in an alliance. But I think a lot of political scientists would emphasize the convergence of interests that forces them to act in an alliance, that Russia, France, and Germany probably couldn't afford for Germany to cement their rise in power. And so even if it wasn't written down, even if they didn't intentionally agree to it, there was in effect an alliance created by this sort of structure. And then just the last thing, some of the description of Britain indicates that there were lots of people opposed to war and not very many people enthusiastic about war. And I think you could read the evidence in a different way that shows that structure basically just mowed them down, that I could see contingency in a lot of other areas, you know, among the Austrians and the Russians. But in the British case, they actually were forced by the structure towards the war, and the fact that between the morning and the afternoon the opposition was defeated sort of indicates the fact that individual implacable tension was just mowed down by the structure of the situation. They couldn't afford for Germany to start a war that they could win, and therefore rebalance the whole world structure. Right. Thank you.
Do you want to handle that? It seems like it was more directed at you.
Well, I couldn't disagree more, is my best response. It seems to me that what you are calling these structural constraints are context. And context, to my mind, is people make decisions within context. That's just an obvious point for a historian. You have to understand the context of the time. But the British were not forced into this at all, except by considerations of party politics. I mean, let's consider what would have happened. Gray said that he would resign if they don't support the French. Other people in the Conservative Party have said, we'll join in too. It's a political decision. It's not shaped by this context. They really don't know what will happen. Gray has to persuade them that no matter what happens, whether we go in or whether we stay out, it'll be bad for us. But there are a large number of people who don't believe that in the slightest. If you look at what Gray says on Monday to the House of Commons, he knows his audience. He puts his emphasis upon higher moral principles. We are pledged to defend Belgium. If it's a question of honor, amongst other things, he's not arguing that the context of he does say, no matter how it turns out, we'll be affected, but I think that has more to do with what Nick has emphasized. A war breaks up the international trading system, the international community. I don't think it has anything to do with expectations of support. Without binding alliances, you're not obliged to do anything. I don't understand how looking at it would force you into doing these things, because it nearly doesn't. And it seems to me has way more to do with people than it does with sort of ineluctable forces that make things happen. I suppose this is an argument about free will versus determinism of some sort at one level. But it's very, very clear that a different day, and the cabinet might have voted the other way and stayed out. When you read all of the participants, and there's a substantial number of participants who wrote it at exactly the time what was going on and why they decided what they did. None of them are saying, well, the people in the Foreign Office, the civil servants who deal with foreign policy on a day-to-day basis, make arguments along the lines of, we should do this because it's to our real advantage. But they don't make the decisions. And that's what is so frustrating to them. Many of them are incredibly angry with what's going on. They think the politicians are going to shirk what they see as their duty or their responsibility because they just aren't practical people. But that's what you'd expect from civil servants. They don't have the political responsibility. The people who have political responsibility, all of them are arguing at a very different level and on a very different basis. It's more ideological basis and more moral basis than it has to do with anything about the need to go to war because of raison d'etat, we might say.
Yeah, I would just add, I generally agree with Keith about the British position, that is, that for the most part there really was a free hand in London. France and Russia are an interesting case because to a large extent they actually have the closest coordination, of any two nations in this entire process. The closest political coordination and particularly the closest military coordination, where they actually are bound, at least treaty-bound, pledge-bound with the terms of their alliance. Both of them are expected to mount offensives by mobilization day plus 15 against Germany. Now, the Russians are, of course, by no means that efficient, and the French have all kinds of concerns about whether Russia is going to hold up its end, which is one of the reasons why they deliberately sanction, that is, they go along with Russia's early mobilization, because the Russians do need a bit more time. But that said, once the decision is made in Russia, in a certain sense, it's made in France. They did have to get a few more politicians on board. Viviani, the premier, was, by no means really on board. He was not a great admirer of Russia, to put it mildly. But Poincaré is quite clear, and you can actually trace these agreements, although it's difficult to document it because they actually destroyed, I think, a lot of the documents. But there's actually a summit between the French president, premier, and the Russian Tsar between the 20th and 23rd of July. The ambassador is also present. Also, the Russian ambassador to Paris is present there in Petersburg. So this extremely close coordination on the Franco-Russian side, far closer than on the side even between Austria-Hungary and Germany, where there's all kinds of kind of miscommunication going on back and forth. For various reasons, I think that was probably the most effective alliance. I'm not saying there weren't choices. There still were choices. There were very deliberate choices being made in both Russia and France. But those choices were being made with far greater concern for and coordination with the ally than would have been a case in Britain.
David's
Not an ally,
got a question.
exactly.
I think this will have to be the last one.
I'm not a political scientist. I'm a communications person. And I want to, Professor McMeekin, kind of pose a little bit of a counterfactual. You talked about miscommunication, communication confusion. Okay? So the primary means of communication was the telegraph.
Right.
Right? If the telephone had worked, if we had a working international telephone system in July and August 1914, what might or might not happen?
Or Skype, yes. Well, yeah, face-to-face communication, of course, that might have actually caused more friction than, telephone communication without the faces. No, it's a very good question, because I think had you had that kind of instantaneous communication, I mean, this is a funny story about the Cuban Missile Crisis, of course, is that Khrushchev has this absurd back channel, and the Americans are trying to figure out, did this guy go to school with Khrushchev, 30 years ago? Is he actually speaking for Khrushchev? Whereas, of course, he could have just called him up on the phone. Right? It seemed absurd, and that's part of the reason they famously eventually did install a direct phone link, so that this would presumably not happen again. I think had the Kaiser and the Tsar actually been able, those two men alone, had they had a direct phone conversation or contact, I think in late July, I think there's a very good chance that both men would have actually been able to assert more weight in affairs, because they kept getting either badgered or manipulated by their subordinates. Even Bethmann, despite his cold feet at the last minute, had manipulated the Kaiser's own mediation proposal, the previous day. So had the Kaiser, let's say, been able to call up Emperor Franz Joseph as well, or even just get his ambassador on the phone to berate him, as he actually did earlier in July when he berated his ambassador from the other direction, saying, you're being too soft, we need to be, firm. It's true, his emotional reactions were so extreme sometimes that it's difficult to predict the way in which the Kaiser might have reacted, but based on the written record we have, he did go on record on multiple occasions saying that he actually did want to defuse the crisis, he did want the Austrians to negotiate. That the Tsar as well, his own inclination is far less belligerent than that of his ministers. So if the heads of state had been able to communicate directly, I think there is a very good chance, I'm not going to say it absolutely would have turned out differently, but there's a very good chance that they would have actually been able to exert more control without this careful manipulation by their subordinates.
I think that will be the last word. We have lunch. Is that...
Yes.